be on. I'm not sure.
Oh. Make sure it's closed off. No sound. Do you still have feedback on there?
The sound quality isn't great. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you perfectly fine. I do apologize about that. I don't know if you need more volume or... Okay.
I can hear you well enough. Let's go ahead and get started.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know what's going on. All right, so my name is Rocio, and currently we have an audio connection on my end. I can hear Ann fine, but we have Ann Stone on the phone from PPAI, who will give us a presentation on the changes that are coming to Proposition 65. And I will go ahead and start showing her screen. Thank you, Ann, so much for joining us today for doing this. And I think we've got your screen up now. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Ready?
I think so. Can you hear see my screen now?
I can see it perfectly. Oh, and one more thing that I forgot to tell everyone. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to type them out in the questions panel. I will go ahead and forward them to Ann, and she will go ahead and gladly answer them for you. Okay, no more interruptions, sorry.
Great, thank you, and thanks for allowing me the opportunity to talk about some of the changes that are happening with Proposition 65. And I think just by joining this call, you're going to be better prepared when certain changes happen in about 2 years. So I always start with the typical disclaimer. This information is being furnished by PPAI for educational and informational purposes only. If you have really specific questions that relate to your business, it's important to seek appropriate counsel. So with that out of the way, we're seeing a lot of states passing new chemical regulations. More and more, increasingly, we're looking at this real patchwork of regulations that make it very hard for businesses to be able to predict how to run their business, what kind of labels to put on products. And the regulations vary from one state to another, and many more were being issued. And the question is why? Well, it really was because of this perceived data gap. And a lot of it is because of TSCA. The Toxic Substances Control Act was passed 40 years ago, 1976. And essentially, it was unchanged for all 40 years. The EPA is responsible for administering TSCA, and it applies to chemicals based on their intended use. So right now, well, actually back up a little bit. In 1976, when TSCA was originally passed, what they did was they grandfathered in all the chemicals that were being commonly used at the time, 62,000 chemicals, and said, you know what? We're just going to let these stay on the market. We're not going to have any restrictions. We're just going to basically grandfather them in as safe and focus on the new chemicals that we're going to add to the inventory going forward. So since 1976, 21,000 new chemicals were added to the EPA TSCA inventory of chemicals. So there was no review of the 62,000 existing chemicals. There was no toxicity testing or exposure assessment. And even for those 21,000 new chemicals, the burden has always been on the EPA, not industry, to prove that the products are safe. And the EPA had to require the least burdensome regulatory requirements. So basically, they wanted to institute a ban on asbestos, and it was actually shot down in court because it was not the least burdensome regulatory requirement, which was how the rules were written. So we're looking now at 80,000 chemicals in the TSCA inventory, and the EPA has actually only been able to require testing for 400 and a ban on 5. So obviously, TSCA is not a powerful piece of regulation that's addressing all the chemicals that are in inventory. And that's why a lot of the different states started passing their own regulations saying, given that TSCA has 80,000 chemicals in inventory and it hasn't tested and it hasn't banned and it hasn't scrutinized all of them, we're going to do it ourselves. And that's why we saw so many different pieces of regulation going on. And that's really what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to start with California because those are the biggest issues for us. There's California Prop 65 that probably most of you are already really familiar with. And then there's the Safer Consumer Products legislation, which is often called green chemistry. I love this quote. I just heard this one recently. There's science, logic, and reason. There's thought verified by experience, and then there's California. So I'm going to pick on California, but as many of you know, Prop 65 was passed by voters in California in 1986. So it's not a bill you can a law you can lobby against because it was a voter initiative. If we were to try to get Prop 65 to go away, we would actually have to have the voters in California vote to repeal a law that gives them a chance to make an informed decision before they're exposed to chemicals. So that's not going to happen. I mean, on the face of it, Prop 65 makes a lot of sense that you do want to be informed before you're exposed to chemicals that could cause cancer or birth defects. The problem is that it's not that simple in California. So California Prop 65 is administered by California's Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, commonly referred to as OEHA. Every year, OEHA has to publish a list of chemicals known to cause cancer, birth defects, or other reproductive harm. When Prop 65 was first passed, that list included 300 chemicals. It now includes more than 900 different chemicals. Once OEHA lists a chemical, a company has 12 months to comply with the appropriate warning requirements. And it applies to anyone in the course of doing business, all businesses that employ 10 or more employees, including part-time workers, and addresses both the environment and the products. Is the chemical in the environment? Is the chemical in the product? Either way, people need to be warned. The other thing that you have to think about with Prop 65 is if you are a distributor in New York, buying from a supplier based in Florida, selling to an end buyer based in Minnesota who distributes those products at a trade show in California, everyone in the supply chain is liable. So because you're in New York or in New Jersey, it doesn't protect you from being liable under Prop 65. This is an entire supply chain kind of issue. But it's only about warning. There's no reason to test for all 900 chemicals in the product as it stands today. What you need to do is know if any of those 900 chemicals are in the product, and if they are in the product, then you need to warn. You need to provide a clear and reasonable warning before exposing anyone to the chemical. This warning, this product contains a chemical known to the state of California to cause cancer. Warning, this product contains a chemical known to the state of California to cause birth defects or other reproductive harm. These warnings, they can be stickers, they can be hang tags, it can be a sign. But the warning needs to be presented before anyone is exposed to the product. So they can be on the product, they can be on the shelf, they can be on a website. They're not required on websites that don't sell the product, and the warnings are not required outside the state of California. So it's only in California. And in California, the signs are everywhere. They are so ubiquitous, people don't even pay attention to them anymore. You're going to see them, you land on a plane, you take a plane to California, you get off the plane, one of the first things you're going to see is a Prop 65 warning sign on the jet bridge that takes you into the airport. They are everywhere. So people in California are pretty immune to them. The challenge is if you're putting this warning on products and you're selling them to people who, or distributing them to people who aren't in California, it can really be quite alarming for them, and they're going to be taken aback and they're going to be asking a lot of questions. That's why it's really important for distributors to be asking, where is this product going? Would or could it be distributed in California? Label it appropriately, because you don't want to label everything, but it's really expensive if you don't label something that needs to be labeled in California. Now, the other thing about Prop 65 is it's an exposure regulation. It's how are you exposed to the chemical? It can be through eating it, breathing it, having it absorbed through your skin, or even having it be transferred from your hand to your mouth. And the exposure is measured in micrograms per day based on the average use of the product, and that's really difficult. the maker of the product. The biggest problem with Prop 65 is how it's enforced. It's enforced by a 60-day notice that is issued by either the state attorney general's office, district and city attorneys, or private enforcers who are often called bounty hunters. These are companies with teddy bear names like the Center for Environmental Health, but what they really do is they look for those products that are likely to trigger a Prop 65 warning. Look for the lack of a warning, test the product, and then file a 60-day notice against the maker of the product, and it gets really expensive really fast. So here's an example. California recently put BPA on the Prop 65 list. It's a hazard-based decision based on exposure. California adopted a limit for BPA skin exposures of 3 micrograms per day. The FDA's daily intake limit from food is about 2,700 micrograms per day. So California's level is way lower than the federal level. And Prop 65 bounty hunters only have to show your product contains BPA, then you have to show that the daily exposure based on typical use of the product is below 3 micrograms per day. So nearly impossible for you to defend that claim, and certainly very expensive. You're going to have to get a toxicologist, you're going to have to study how the product is typically used and how that could be absorbed through your skin based on the typical use. So faced with defending the claim or settling the claim, most people go for settling the claim, but the penalties can be up to, $2,500 per day per violation. And then the private enforcers enter into settlements with the state to split the money. So, for example, you're shipping 500 mugs. They're distributed in California. There's no warning associated with it. $2,500 per mug. Your one-day charge for a penalty is going to be over $1 million. That's why people settle. That's why I consider this to be one of the biggest threats to our industry that we have, and that's why it's so important people understand that they need to comply with these warning requirements or they could be faced with some pretty big penalties. And who wins? It's 75% of the fees go to attorneys. So that's the only winner in all of this typically. Settlements by year are just increasing. In 2012, it was about 22 million, 2013, 17 million, 2015, $29 million. So it's a very, very expensive enterprise. Typically, bounty hunters kind of follow some trends. They go after common products. They go after, once a product is listed in a Prop 65 notice, and you can track that all on the OEHA site, so it's oeha.gov, oeha.ca.gov. Then you can go there and you can kind of see what the trends are. But a lot of 60-day notices recently focus on lead, leather, and brass, because brass contains lead. So it could be keychains, pens, pen holders. It could be, belts, bags, coffee mugs. They also look at phthalates a lot. Phthalates are a chemical that's added to plastic to make plastic pliable and bendable. So you're going to find phthalates that are in plastic or vinyl, gym bags, shower bath accessories, checkbook covers, wireless cable chargers, travel cases. So those are all places where items that are kind of scrutinized by bounty hunters. So what can a supplier or importer do? Well, they can check the chemical list that's published by OEHA, and I mentioned that a little bit before at oeha.ca.gov. You could test for all 900 chemicals, but people don't do that because it's not reasonable and it's incredibly expensive. So you need to know what chemicals are on the product and test the product if it contains chemicals noted on the OEHA list. You may want to engage a toxicologist to review the product regarding the safe harbor limits. But most importantly, you want to label with the appropriate Prop 65 warning statement. For distributors, you really need to ask if the product will or could be distributed in California, and then tell the supplier, because if you're not asking that question, getting an answer, and telling the supplier is unwittingly at risk, because most suppliers do not default to putting a warning label on products unless they know they're going to California, because they don't want to unreasonably alarm recipients who are outside the state of California. So think about that. You want to check the chemical list yourself. You want to confirm with the supplier that none of the 900 chemicals are in the product. Ask for test reports, and then make sure the product is labeled appropriately.
Excuse me, Anna?
So, yes.
We have a question from Robert Bruno. He was wondering if these requirements extend to federal buyers within California.
If they extend to what?
Extend to federal buyers within California.
So these Prop 65 warnings apply to any product that is distributed in California. So if a federal buyer was distributing the products in California and a bounty hunter got a hold of it, they would likely file a 60-day notice against everyone. I'm not an attorney. This isn't legal advice. I don't think they could file the 60-day notice against the federal buyer itself, but I think that they would apply it against everyone else.
Thank you.
So faced with all of this with Prop 65, Governor Jerry Brown actually challenged California to reform Prop 65 in May of 2013. And the intent of the reform was to end frivolous shakedown lawsuits, improve how the public is warned about chemicals, and strengthen the scientific basis for the warning label. So these new regulations were just adopted on August 30th of 2016, so just a couple months ago. They're going to go into effect in 2 years on August 30th, 2018. And the new requirements will not apply to existing inventory. So products manufactured distributed on August 29th, 2018, you can treat them just the way you've been treating them all day long. But there are new rules going forward. And unfortunately, those new rules really, the reform of Prop 65 does not address the principles that Jerry Brown identified in 2013. And in most cases, it's going to make our lives more difficult, not less difficult. I know I feel like I'm always depressing everyone with these presentations. So here are the changes, and these are what you're going to see on Prop 65 warnings going forward. They can be adopted at any point between now and 2018, but they're not required until 2018. And there's still some debate over whether you really need to change to these new rules. I spoke to an attorney a few weeks ago, and they said, you know, if you want to take advantage of the safe harbor, then you absolutely have to follow the new rules. And that really means if you really want to guarantee that you're safe from 60-day notices. We are going to have an attorney join us at Expo who's going to go into more detail on all of this. So if you want more information, you can just check our website or give me a call directly. But basically, as of August 30th, 2018, the warnings now need to contain the use of the phrase, this product can expose you to blank, and specifically name the chemical that you're being exposed to. So this product can expose you to lead. The warning must be preceded by a bold, black outlined yellow equilateral triangle with an exclamation point in the center. If there are internet sales, the warnings need to be included online, and when foreign languages are used, the warning must also be in those languages. And this is what the warnings are going to look like. On the left-hand side of your screen is the current warning. On the right-hand side are 3 options that are based on the new warning. The first one is this product can expose you to chemicals including blank, which is known to the state of California to cause cancer. For more information, go to prop65warningscalifornia.gov. Or this product can expose you to chemicals including blank, known to the state of California to cause birth defects or other reproductive harm. And finally, my personal favorite, warning, cancer, followed by the website. So all of these are pretty alarming to look at. The intent of the reform was to have the equilateral triangle to just make you graphically make it catch your eye, because as I said at the very beginning of the presentation, people in California are immune to this. We're not paying attention to this. And then they also wanted to be more specific about the product. About the chemical. that is triggering the exposure warning. The only way under these new rules to get away from specifically listing the chemical that you're warning against is to go with the last one, which is warning cancer, taking you to the California Prop 65 site. The other challenge here is that the warnings must now be given at or before the point of purchase. So you don't want to rely on any sort of package insert warnings or warnings on invoices. You need to have a product-specific warning that automatically provides warning to the purchaser before or during the purchase transaction without them seeking it out. So it needs to be on the product as an on-product warning label, or a sign at the point of display, or if it's in a catalog, in the catalog associated with the product. If you're selling the product online, a warning needs to be on the display page. There needs to be a hyperlink marked warning, and it needs to be prominently displayed prior to completion of the purchase. If a product's sold online, it must have an online warning, even if it also has that on-product warning label. And the warning applies to downstream customers as well. So if you buy, you're a distributor, you buy the product online from a supplier, and then you have an e-commerce platform that you're selling to your customer, you need to have the warning there too to comply with the safe harbor protections under this new Prop 65 warning. So what can we expect looking forward? Well, you can expect the new warning style to raise a lot of questions and concerns. People are going to be a little alarmed by it, whether they're in California or not. You can also expect Prop 65 bounty hunters to be looking online for those items that should have a warning where they don't see a warning online, and probably filing 60-day notices against those companies. So those are the things you need to be aware of. The good news in this is we have a long runway. We have until August of 2018 to figure this all out. That's not great, but it's good. We also have a lot of smart people and a lot of big companies who are going to have to comply with these rules as well. And so I'm thinking we're going to have people taking on the lead, and that we can monitor what direction they're taking in complying with these new regulations and model our behavior on them. So just keep an eye out for a lot more information about Prop 65 warning requirements, and start preparing yourself now to be complying with those new rules in 2018. So now I'm going to move on to the other California regulation, a few other regulations, and then we'll have time for questions because I'm sure I've triggered probably a significant amount of concern by everyone on the call. So moving on to California Green Chemistry, that was an initiative that really was designed to close that data gap that we identified with TSCA. It was to say, if we look at a chemical product combination, ask yourself two questions. Is the chemical necessary, and is there a safer alternative? And the goal was to conduct a thorough analysis of what the alternatives might be. This went into effect October 1st of 2013. It was supposed to be phased in over time, but I really haven't seen much movement on it at all. And it's a four-step process. California identifies a chemical and a product combination. Then they list priority products, and then they put the burden on companies to do an alternative analysis to figure out, is there a safer product, a safer chemical that you can replace it with. California can then have a regulatory response to say, you know what, we're going to ban this chemical, we're going to insist that you replace it with this chemical, or some combination of the two. So what they did was they listed in 2013 really 3 priority product chemical candidates: spray foam with unreacted disocyanates, children's foam sleeping pads that had some sort of flame retardant containing tris, and paint and varnish strippers. So they put that out there, and then they said, okay, we're going to have more coming, but they really haven't moved forward very much at all since that point. They did finalize a 3-year work plan in April 2015 where they said, you know what, these are the products that we think we're going to focus on next. And out of this list, my concerns for our industry are really clothing more than anything else, um, because they're going to look at chemical product combinations. So we're continuing to take a very close look at all of this, but at the moment, very little is happening, and I suspect not a whole lot is going to be happening in the short term, but I've been wrong before. I don't know. But we will keep an eye on it. We will report on anything that is happening with green chemistry, and you can always catch up on that in NewsLink. That's where we'll report it first. So in the beginning of the session, I talked about the patchwork of state regulations that are popping up. And this is just a quick list of some of the states that have their own state regulations. There's a regulation about toxics in packaging. It's a Northeast Recycling Council. It's called NERC. And what they're really focused on are heavy metals leaching into our water system. So there are specific rules about toxics in packaging. That could be cardboard for a box. It could be the glue. It could be the tape associated with the box. It could be plastic foam peanuts in the box, all part of the packaging. So you need to be asking questions about the packaging that your production partners are using. There's an Illinois Lead Poisoning Prevention Act. So we have the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act that was passed in 2008 for children's products. It dropped the lead limit down to 190 parts per million and required third-party testing. Well, Illinois then dropped their limit for children's products to 40 parts per million. So nobody's going to manufacture, well, nobody wants to label their products going into Illinois saying, you know, this product contains lead or dust that can be harmful. So essentially it dropped the federal limit for lead to 40 parts per million more than anything else. Again, the good news associated with that is when products are tested, typically I've been told they fail by a mile for lead, or lead is just not really detected in the product. So jumping from 600 parts per million to 90 parts per million to 40 parts per million is not as significant as those numbers might lead you to believe. Washington State has a reporting requirement for 66 different chemicals, and if those 66 different chemicals, if any of them are in children's products, you have to report it to Washington State with the goal of, if you have to report, let's just make sure we start eliminating those products and replacing them with something else. Maine has something very similar. Vermont has something very similar. Oregon has something very similar. And we're seeing a lot of the reporting requirements. I call all of this out here, but I would say all of these are far less punitive than the Prop 65. That's going to be the thing that you really need to keep an eye on, but it is important that you comply with all of these state regulations, and there are many more that I have not listed here. We have a list on our website that we update on a pretty regular basis. You can also get updated lists from any third-party lab. They're always happy to help you with that. And then there are regulatory categories that a lot of these states are looking at. They tend to focus more than anything else on children's products. That's where most of these rules are focused. They're also focused on flame retardants, whether it's flame retardants in children's sleepwear or flame retardants in other things, mattresses, furniture, things of that nature. I suspect we're going to see a lot more focus on flame retardants going forward. PPAI, that's been in the news for ages and ages and ages. There are suffocation warnings that you need to apply to plastic bags. Stuffed toys have their own labeling and licensing rules. There are regulatory rules associated with jewelry, primarily children's jewelry. Restriction of hazardous substances, that's from Europe, and it's really talking, it's more about electronics than anything else. And then there's also regulatory focus on both the state and federal level on drawstrings, on children's upper outerwear. So you want to avoid any children's sweatshirts, hoodies, jackets that have any drawstrings around the neck or waist. Those are actually banned as a federal regulatory rule. So just keep that in mind. It's, you know, it's one of those things where you don't need an expensive XRF gun to identify that violation. You can just see it and know it. So avoid drawstrings on children's upper outerwear. So I said a lot at the beginning about how many of these state regulations were triggered by TSCA and the lack of reform to TSCA for the last 40 years. Well, just this year, in June of 2016, they finally passed TSCA reform, the Frank Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act. It was signed into law in June of this year and went into effect immediately. There's some significant changes with this rule. First of all, it resets the TSCA inventory. So we talked about those 80,000 chemicals that were in inventory. Some were existing inventory, some of them were current inventory. They're all now set as active chemicals. And what the EPA is now tasked to do is to conduct risk evaluations for both new and existing chemicals. So new chemicals need a safety determination before entering the market. Existing chemicals are creating a work list based on priority to evaluate all of those existing chemicals. And the EPA is working on prioritizing how they're going to go through this inventory of 80,000 chemicals. So the EPA has some mandatory deadlines. They can no longer look at the cost of the test or the burden on industry for the test. They have new definitions for a bunch of things. They set limits on confidential business information claims. You can't just claim, I'm sorry, that's confidential. No, the EPA still can test it if they want to. There are new fees. They increase the penalties. And Lautenberg offers some preemption, but nowhere near what we wanted. I mean, in a perfect world, you pass Lautenberg and it would preempt every single state regulation, and that did not happen. They do define susceptible subpopulations. Basically, they're going to look, I would guess, at chemicals that would pose a risk to the young and the elderly. And they also can start looking at potential cancer clusters. So, impact on our industry. They are probably going to be looking at chemicals that are in some of our printing inks, some of our paints and coatings, some things for fabric treatment, whether it's flame retardants, water repellents, wicking treatments. They'll probably be looking at some writing instruments, maybe adhesives on sticky notes. Those are all things they could be looking at, but we don't know yet. So the role in the industry really is key. If you are an importer, you're a manufacturer, and that means you need to be following this pretty closely. So if you are manufacturing the product yourself as a domestic manufacturer, you're a supplier. If you're importing the product, whether a supplier or a distributor, you're the manufacturer. And there are a lot of points of intersection. So you could look at something that is now the EPA is looking at the chemical, but the FDA and the CPSC all have some control over it. So like take a children's toothbrush. Currently, that's dual jurisdiction. It's covered by the FDA and it's covered by the CPSC. Now add in a chemical that is on the EPA's list for scrutiny, and now it's being scrutinized by 3 different regulatory agencies. So it gets complicated quickly. They're going to look at the kind of product, the chemical that's used, current foreseeable uses, exposure throughout the supply chain, and again, they're going to focus on those susceptible subpopulations. So the EPA has to have a procedural rule for how they're going to prioritize looking at chemicals by June of 2017. So 1 year, really this rule gave the EPA 1 year to set up how they're going to prioritize this process. And then it's going to be based on risk-based screening. And we think they're going to start probably with the chemicals they already had developed in 2014. But you want to review your whole portfolio of products to determine if any have any chemicals that may be on that high priority list. And if you do use those chemicals that end up on that list, there could be disruption to the supply chain. You may be required to identify alternative products, alternative chemicals. And what you're going to have to do is not just evaluate whether the chemical works, but what's the relative safeness of the substitution chemical. So they don't want unfortunate substitutions where you're replacing one chemical with something that's just as bad. So an example here would be, let's say you're making jewelry and you're using lead in the jewelry because lead is inexpensive, highly malleable and pretty easy to work with. So if lead ends up on the list, and I suspect it will, then you would replace it maybe with cadmium. That would be probably considered an unfortunate substitution because cadmium comes with its own challenges. So again, none of this has come to pass, but these are all things that you need to be keeping an eye on going forward. And I talked about the weak preemption. So TSCA reform specifically does not preempt California Prop 65. And all pre-existing state regulations are also specifically exempted. So all the things that I've talked about on this webinar will continue to be challenges for the industry moving forward. The good news is that once the EPA starts evaluating a chemical, states have to stop all rulemaking related to regulating that chemical until after the EPA finishes its evaluation or the deadline expires. And if the EPA determines a chemical to be a low risk, then state regulation is preempted on a permanent basis. So what's next? Well, next month, EPA is supposed to list their first 10 new work plan chemicals. So we'll keep an eye on it. We'll report on it as soon as we know anything. In June, they're going to have their final method for prioritizing the chemicals and the risk evaluation method for those high priority chemicals. And then in another year, they have to propose their alternative toxicity testing strategy. So they have a lot of work ahead of them as they go through an inventory of 80,000 different chemicals. And so you're going to just need to keep an eye out, and we will do our best to be timely in our reporting of any developments associated with this reform. So that takes me to the last of the prepared remarks on Prop 65 and state regulations. And at this point, I'm happy to answer any questions anyone might have.
Okay, a lot of information. So we have a question from Randy. If we use a SAGE website which pulls from supplier info, will the warnings show up in the item descriptions? Is PPAI working with SAGE to coordinate?
So the answer to that question would be I don't know and yes. So I don't know exactly how the warning labels or the warning language will appear online right now. That's something that everybody's going to need to work through. But I can tell you, yes, this rule came out in August 30th this year, and I was on the phone with SAGE within the week, making sure they were aware of it. So it is something that they are addressing. And like I said, the good news here is that we have a long runway, and we need to figure out more following other people's models on exactly how we're going to manage that online warning component.
Okay. And that was the only question that came in since the last one from Robert. I encourage anyone if they want to ask a question, please do so now. These are very important points to take notice of and to make sure that we educate ourselves so that we don't end up paying these astronomical penalties that I saw there. So this webinar has also been recorded. It will be put up on our YouTube channel. And once Anne has more information in regards to these regulations, and we will for sure have you back on to inform us more. I have a question from Daniel Berkowitz. Under current rules, a small business under 10 employees are exempt. Will this continue as an exemption? I think that's what.
To the best of my knowledge, yes. I do not believe that there are any changes to that exemption under the new regulations, that if you have 9 or fewer employees, including part-time workers, you're not subject to those 60-day notices. That being said, all of your trading partners still will be. So your customer is likely to have more than 10 employees, your supplier is likely to have more, and you want to make sure, even if you're protected, that you're doing your due diligence to protect those around you. So that's why one of the most important questions any distributor can ask their customers, would or could this product be distributed in California? Get an answer. Have your customer think about it, because your customer might if your customer is in, Pennsylvania, odds are they're not thinking about Prop 65 at all. They may be completely unaware of it and just get products for all their trade shows and unwittingly be distributing those products in California. So it's really important to ask that question, tell them why you're asking that question, differentiate yourselves from your competition who's failing to ask that question, and then tell your supplier so that they can label accordingly. Because, like I said, most suppliers do not default to warning on all products. Also, be prepared. Some suppliers charge more for those warning labels, and once they have to add a color to the warning label, they're likely to charge a little bit more. So it all depends. It varies from one supplier to another, but it's a really important question to ask both sides of your supply chain.
Thank you, Anne. I don't have any other questions at the moment. But if anyone has questions that come up later on, you can email Anne. Her email address is right there, anns@ppai.org, or you can email me too. It's Rocio, ROCIO, @sagni.org. And thank you again for joining us today and for giving us this information that's extremely important for all of our members. And we will see you soon, I guess. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, and have a wonderful day, everyone.